Hello, my name is Jeff Ullman. I am a contractor to the Colorado Water Conservation Board. This recording here is Appendix A, and I'm going to cover in detail some of the hydrologic variations that we did as part of the rain on mesh sensitivity study. I would suggest you watching the first recording if you haven't done so already. That'll give an overview and greater context on the objective and the purpose of the study, as well as the process and the key findings. This part here is meant to go over in detail the actual hydrologic variation simulations, the results extracted from the 47 connections that are integrated in the larger model. And it's meant to be more of an appendix with supporting information, so it does get into some of the nitty-gritty of the process and results for the hydrologic variation. So please see Appendix B if you're interested in details on the hydraulic variations.
This slide gives a higher level overview of the hydrologic analyses that were done. This was done on a larger model, again with 47 connections. And there's 182 simulations that were done with varied distribution and duration, depth and confidence limit, and the curve number or loss calculations that'll be summarized in greater detail in the next slide. And what remained fixed or constant across each of the simulations was that underlying terrain of an 8-foot cell size was used. Settings with max current of 1.5 and minimum time step were used of 1.8 seconds using the adjustable time step in HEC-RAS 507. Mesh cells of 200 foot were used nominally with 50-foot refinements across the stream center lines as break lines. And we used the same set of break lines across all of the data sets, including V notches in the channel where appropriate. Manning's end was determined based on the National Land Cover Database 2016. And it's important to note that all of the simulations done were all the 1% annual chance event or the 100-year event, and no depth area reduction factors were applied, considering the different drainage areas used here. And all the information was extracted at different stage and flow hydrographs at each of the connections inserted in the model.
This slide summarizes the different hydrologic variations that were actually implemented. So we looked at 6 different durations across 3 different families, you might call it. So we looked at the half hour, the hour, 3 hour, 6 hour, 12 hour, and 24-hour durations. And we applied these to this SES type 2. So that's where you get 6 of them because of 6 durations, to the NOAA Atlas 14, looking at 5 different deciles for each of the 4 quartiles. So that's how you get to 120. And then we looked at the nested hyetograph, which is from the MSC 1 through 6, which NRCS provides, and MSC stands for Middle Southeast States. And then we also looked at different depths by confidence limit. So there was 5 confidence limits that we looked at between 0.1 to 0.9, where 0.5 is the median. These were applied to 2 different durations for SES type 2, 1 duration for MSC 2, which is most representative of our area. And then those 5 were also applied to the NOAA quartile 1, decile 1 for 2 different durations. In terms of the loss, we looked at 5 different curved numbers, looking at antecedent moisture conditions for 1, 2, and 3, and then we took the average of 1 and 2 to come up with 1.5, and the average of 2 and 3 to come up with 2.5, and we applied these to the 6-hour and 24-hour durations for the SES type 2, nested MSC 2, and then the NOAA first quartile and first decile. This slide summarizes information on NOAA. Some of you may be familiar with all this, but NOAA Atlas 14 data has been provided for most of the nation, everything except the Northwest region, which I believe they're working on, and it's been phased across different years. Many of you might be familiar with the graphic on the upper right here. This is the point precipitation frequency map. They also have gridded data across the entire nation. So NOAA it's a frequently relied upon resource for obtaining precipitation depth by duration and frequency, but it's also a source for varied depth by confidence limit, and for intensities, and also for temporal distributions. NOAA also provides information on the likelihood of each quartile that might occur in a region based on records of historic storms. So that's what you see there in the bottom right. Which is actually just a snapshot or a couple snippets from the Region 2 stats. You can see for Western Colorado, this is Region 2 from Volume 8. And this shows how many storms were recorded and then how many fall within each of the different quartiles. So from this information, you can see that most of the storms, regardless of duration, occur within that first quartile, which is why type 2, SCS type 2, is often fit fairly well. And the least happen in the fourth quartile there. You can also see that most of the storms happen in 12-hour or less when you just look at the totals here, but that there are a fair amount with longer durations as well. This slide shows additional information for NOAA specific to the distributions that they provide. So for each of the volumes, and Colorado is located in volume 8, NOAA Atlas 14 will provide 40 different distributions per duration per region. So there's 4 quartiles and 10 deciles within each one. And so on the left is an example of these distributions for the 24-hour. We also have this information for the 6-hour, 12-hour, and the 96 hours. These distributions show the cumulative percent precipitation over time. So the steeper the curve, the more intense the rainfall. So curves like the first decile of quartile 1 and the 9th decile of quartile 4 will have the highest rainfall intensities. They're just separated at opposite times of the storm. Curves like the 9th decile of the first quartile and the first decile of the 4th quartile will have some of the most gradual intensities, as the curve is not as steep and more of the rain is spread out over time. So we use these curves and compress them as needed to go below the 6-hour storm when we're looking at the half-hour, the 1-hour, and the 3-hour. And for the purposes of this study, we ran simulations using the five of the deciles, so 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, rather than all of them across all 4 quartiles. The graphics at the right help illustrate the difference between the different distributions. And for those wondering how closely these transition, so here is the first quartile, 9th decile in dashed red, and as you can see, it does not closely match the second quartile, decile 1. So it's not as though that these are sequential or transition between them, but instead they represent different times at which the intensity is greater or lesser through time. As for the SCS type 2 distribution, I'll assume that most watching this have heard that term before, as it's been the default storm distribution modeling for some time in Colorado. You can see here's a map showing, here's Colorado, and this falls under the type 2. There's other types, type 1, 1A, and 3 that are used in the rest of the nation that the Soil Conservation Service had come up with, but type 2 fits our region. And so here's an example of what the actual distribution looks like. You can see it is the steepest among them, similar to the 3 here, but you can see right in here it has a higher intensity at the middle of the storm, assuming a 24-hour duration. So we just took that curve, here's the same 24-hour shape, and then just compressed it for each of the different storm durations to use. Now, something that some people are not as familiar with is that NRCS has kind of maybe distanced themselves a little bit from the SCS type 2, well, actually most of the distributions, and now they're advocating more for a nested hyetograph, which we'll look at next. But the reason being, and I'll let you read this on your own, is that there's really not that much data surviving that supports the creation of this curve here. And when this was first done in the 70s, or even in the 60s, it made good sense at the time to use this, but we basically have far superior data now to help us create better distributions. So on that note, like I mentioned, they're advocating for what's called a nested distribution type, and essentially it's a 24-hour duration, but it's actually independent of duration in terms of it captures the maximum intensity from each of the durations. So it'll look at the 3-hour storm, the 6-hour storm, the 12-hour storm, etc., and it'll pack that intensity, and so it's steepest here, and in 1-hour bracket you'll have a very intense portion, but it'll be more gradual than what we see in a type 2 on the tails and the front end, the ramp up. And the reason that is because it's trying to capture in this short period here the highest intensity from the briefer storms, like the 1-hour, but then it has the same volume for the overall 24-hour. So then you're capturing the effect of the intensity, which is often what drives the actual peak flows, across the full spectrum of all the different durations. And this is a map here of Colorado showing the different MSEs. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a few spots where it's 6, but 6 is less intense, where 1 is more intense. So you can see 1 is the blue, which is steeper in here on the sides, whereas green is the 6. So it's more gradual by comparison. And again, this is MSC, which is the Middle Southeast, and this comes from this document here, also provided by the NRCS. So in essence, they're recommending to step away from type 2, but it's been so widely used, we wanted to include it in our study. So with that bit of background on some of the different distributions and the analyses that we did, we'll jump into the actual results themselves. This section is going to review the results in various forms of charts and graphs to draw out some of the findings and observations from the hydrologic variations. Some of the observations are going to be more obvious than others, many of which will be confirming concepts that we would have expected. Knowing that there's a broad range of audience potential viewers here, I'm going to just tend to over-communicate, not knowing the personal experience from each of the viewers. And I'm not going to assume that each has an intimate understanding of the details. However, there's going to be a few concepts and observations that probably necessitate a foundational understanding of hydrology and rain-on mesh modeling in order to understand the implications. This graphic shows the hydrographs as observed at 3 different connections in the model. So you may recall the map on the right here showing these from upstream moving downstream. So we have 25, 44, and 34. Those are the same 3 that are kind of exhibited here to show that increase in the drainage area. And so expect to see these kind of repeated throughout some of the presentation. Now, a few different observations looking at the nested hyetograph here. We see that the peak discharges increase and the hydrographs lengthen as the drainage area increases, and that the timing of the peak observed in the larger drainage area is later than those in the smaller, which is expected. So you see the peak happen earlier in the smallest, a little bit later in the middle, and then a little bit later in the larger one. I also want to point out that there's a notable spread of peak discharges depending on which MSE distributions used, and that the relative spread seems to be consistent kind of regardless of the drainage area, perhaps around 40% vertically between the lowest, which is the MSC 6, and the highest, which is MSC 1, and we see that repeated in each of the different drainage areas here. Now, not surprisingly, whichever gives the flashiest tend to have the lower tail as well. So kind of trying to highlight that here, you can see at the bottom one here, MSC 6 gives a higher tail, the highest, the flashiest, the peak. MSC 1 gives lower on the tail, and again, that all ties back to the distribution where MSC 6 up top is a more gradual application, so it's steeper on the ramp up and on the tail, but more gradual in the middle, whereas MSC 1 is the opposite. So the main takeaway here is that whichever nested distribution you choose has a significant impact here. So thankfully the NRCS provides guidance on which to choose based on the map or spatial files they provide, or you can derive a custom fit based on the ratio of the 1 hour to the 24-hour depths given for a location. And because the peak discharges can be notably influenced by the distribution that you do choose, perhaps by several percent between each of the increments, we would recommend that you would delineate your model basins by distribution when possible. Similar to the previous slide, this slide and the next few are going to use the same color scheme for those 3 same connections. So now we're going to look at different distributions though. So the SES type 2 is shown here for different durations, and the nested, which we just looked at is duration agnostic, in that it includes all the intensities from all durations. The SES type 2 and the NOAA, on the other hand, are highly influenced by the duration selected, which is often a function of the regional climate and drainage area properties. You can see that with increasing duration comes increasing volume and increasing peaks. So while the duration selected does affect the peak flow based on the volume applied over time, it also affects the timing here. So you'll note that the peak of the hydrograph is staggered by approximately half of the difference in the storm duration. So if we look here, this is the 24-hour duration, and if you recall, the peak is applied at half that, so it would have occurred at 12 hours, where this is a 12-hour duration, so the peak would be at 6 hours, so the difference between 6 and 12 is a 6-hour difference, and we see that also reflected here between the 12 and the 6-hour being a 3-hour difference between those peaks. Also, I want to point out that as the storm duration increases, the shape does change up into a point, and then the whole shape just gets larger. So if we look at this as an example, you can see how different this shape is here at the lower duration, this one here being the 1 hour. The half hour is barely even on here. It's the small guy here. And then this being the 3 hour, and then the 6 hour. And then the shape starts to maybe be a little bit more consistent going to the 12 and then in particular the 24. So what this is telling us is for a larger drainage area that you'll need a larger storm, whereas up front you're not quite capturing that peak. It's still kind of more muted. It's mellowed out, whereas you start to see that peak here on the 12 hour and most certainly on the 24 hour. And you see that peak earlier on in the smaller drainages, even at the smaller storms. So something like that can kind of help decide if you've selected a duration that's sufficient enough response for your basin. Continuing with the same three connections, we're going to compare differing NOAA distributions, all using the 24-hour duration over the next 3 slides. This one shows the first decile of the 4 quartiles. The next slide will show the 9th decile of the 4 quartiles, and the following will show the 5th, or the median decile. So you can see here the first decile, first quartile, gives the largest and most peaky response with a steep ramp up and then a limited tail here. And again, this is a reflection primarily of the applied hyetograph that shows the greatest intensity at the beginning in the first quartile, first decile, with more gradual slopes by comparison, and probably somewhat equal between the 3 of them, with quartile 2, 3, and 4, which we see similar peaks between quartiles 2, 3, and 4. In essence, these hydrographs really communicate the effects of rainfall intensities if there's sufficient duration in the modeled basin. You can also see here just the reflection of the timing by the storm duration here in terms of the quartiles. They're each spread out by about 6 hours across the 24-hour duration here. Probably what's of greater note here is, again, just that the second and third, fourth quartiles all yield similar peak discharges, just based on the slope here, whereas the first quartile would have resulted in notably higher discharges, perhaps by 30 or 40%. Moving on to the 9th decile, here we see even a more pronounced effect of this here. And again, this is all coming back to the hydrographs reflecting the hyetographs, how they're applied here. And you can see that the slope is definitely steepest on the quartile 4, decile 9. So we see a much greater pronounced peak. But I want to draw your attention to how this is about 25,000 compared to the 18,000 on the previous slide from Q1D1. This difference between the two and the differences we're increasing here is from another effect of natural watershed storage. The watershed storage is the reason for the difference in the 18 and 25,000, essentially because the natural storage will consume the initial water that's applied, such that the longer that water is gradually applied to the system before the peak intensity, as in this case, there will be less natural storage remaining to mitigate the peak flow at the height of the storm. So if we think back to the previous slide with first decile, first quartile, its peak is being applied at the very beginning before any waters really entered the system. So a lot of the peak is mitigated from natural watershed storage, whereas in this instance, it's had a long duration of a little bit of volume where it's going to consume that natural watershed storage, such that there's less storage available when the actual peak intensity is applied, so you'll have greater peak flows. So then you see this much greater effect here. Now the next slide is going to show some of the same effect in terms of the natural watershed storage, but it's illustrated in a slightly different way. When you look at this in comparison, we see similar slopes between each of the different deciles, all being the median or the 5th decile across it. However, we see an increasing trend that's more pronounced in the larger drainages than it is on the medium, a slightly slower, more gradual slope, and even less so in the smallest drainage. And what you're seeing here in this differences of the peak discharges is almost exclusively related to that natural watershed storage effect, where your quartile 4 has had more time, more volume applied beforehand, so you have greater consumption of that storage, so you have a higher peak. However, in the smaller drainages, like the 6 square mile, there's less of that effect because there's less storage, less watershed area. And similarly, as you increase it, you have a larger effect here. You can also see how that watershed kind of mitigates the tail as well, just by comparison. This is basically more muted, it's depressed and wider as opposed to pronounced and narrower. And there'll be more on that on the following slides about use of restart files and how that pertains to natural watershed storage. Last comment on this slide, you'll see that we've posted the run times here, and you can see how the run times are actually decreasing with later quartiles. And the reason that is simply just a reflection of more water is applied earlier on, so you have more wetted cells that then are perpetuated throughout the simulation, whereas for the later quartile, it takes longer in the simulation before the same number of cells are wetted, so it's a faster computation.
So as mentioned in some of the previous slides, the natural watershed storage can have a significant effect. So we invested the effects of natural watershed storage further with the use of a restart file to consume some of the initial storage present before applying the storm event. So a restart file, which is sometimes called a hot start file, it allows the model to begin its simulations with established conditions in the model that restarts or picks up where a different simulation had left off. So to generate a restart file, we ran the storm subject distribution for 9 days past the specified storm event to allow all mobile water to drain from the model. So only the stagnant or trapped water is retained in the low-lying areas, and that can be in larger pools behind flow obstructions, like in the channel, if you have a pinched area in a canyon or you have high ground, but it also can apply in very small amounts throughout all the individual cells, just very small portions that are retained if there's a low-lying area within. So this remaining volume that's now filled with water would have otherwise retained water during the actual storm event, and depending on the timing of the peak intensity, it could have actually mitigated peak flows, which we saw earlier. So we generated a restart file at the end of a 9-day simulation, and we used that as the initial conditions for subsequent model runs here. And we looked at the effects on different durations and drainage areas for the SES Type 2, which is kind of an abrupt storm, and for NOAA Quartile 2 Decile 5, which is a pretty gradual storm. So this slide here shows flow hydrographs at larger connection, at like 58 square miles drainage area, for conditions with and without a restart file. And the hydrograph is shown for restart files with the dashed line, as you see up here, whereas the base model on terrain as is shown in solid lines. So that's just with every cell starting as dry. So you might remember or recall seeing some of these from this previous graphic that you saw here. So if you look, we've got about 8,000 here and about 13,000 here, and if we go back to that same graphic, you'll see that 8,000 here and the 13,000. So we're using that same data, and now we're adding the effects of what you see on a restart file here. And I think it's quickly apparent how significant the effects are in these larger drainage areas when you look at the difference between the peaks for each of these events. And for some of the smaller ones, especially down here, you can see the events nearly doubling the flows. And then when we get to some of the larger events, it's still a significant portion, maybe almost even a third. So the takeaway here is that the natural watershed storage can be very significant in larger drainage areas, and for briefer durations in particular. So let's take a look now at the effect of the restart files on a smaller drainage on the next slide. So this graph here shows the same test with
SES type 2 and the different durations, but now at a smaller drainage area connection. This has 6 square miles, and you'll notice right away that the effects of the restart file are not nearly as pronounced. And again, that's because we're looking at a smaller drainage area, and perhaps this 6 square mile basin doesn't have as many low-lying areas or features that would retain that water behind. So it's going to be a function of the basin with what you're looking at. And it's important to note that some areas, such as portions of South Dakota, for example, you wouldn't want to actually use a natural watershed storage reduction with the restart file, because there's some features like a lot of glacial divots there that actually should be present in your model. So it's important to understand the terrain that you're modeling, and if you're on the plains of Colorado, perhaps this is something you look at, and if you're in or actually leave in your model. Whereas if you're on steep slopes in the foothills and mountains of Colorado, and they're areas that we know would ultimately drain and they're connected, then you might want to use this to kind of clear out that artificial storage that's being presented. So last comment on here too is you can kind of see how these graphs compared to the previous slide are kind of flashier, a lot narrower, quicker response time to ramp up and to drain. And again, that's an artifact of this being a smaller drainage area and responding more quickly. Now if we look at the effects of the restart file on the NOAA quartile 2 decile 5, so more gradual storm, we see something a little bit different here than what we saw for the SES type 2. This is a larger drainage area again, but you can see here that the effects of the restart file are less pronounced in general, and you can actually see similar impacts across all of them instead of a lessening impact. And part of the reason why we see that is because just by the nature of a Q2D5, if we look at the base, there's a gradual approach to it. So it's almost acting like its own restart file to a degree, because it's actually consuming that storage on the upper portion of the, or on the initial portion of the storm before the peak intensity is applied. So the longer the duration, such as, the green shown for a 24-hour, in this initial ramp up, it's consuming that storage before the peak intensity is applied, so it actually gives it more of a chance to reach a natural flow anyway. Whereas for these shorter durations, you see a larger effect because they haven't had as much time to consume that storage. So here they are with an incremented amount based on that storage having been consumed with a restart file. And you'll notice here that the 12-hour and the 24-hour, when you compare the post-restart files, that these are actually very similar flow rates here. Now if we look at a smaller connection, so 6 square miles, same distribution here, we see something a little bit different here as well, and I forgot to point out on the previous slide, but you'll see it here too. It's basically draining at the same response, restart and without, but it is allowing it to ramp up a little bit quicker just because it's not taking the actual storm itself to use that storage. It's actually just adding to it right away. But in here, you'll notice that the actual 12-hour is higher than the 24-hour, and I think this is the first time we've seen that in our study area at least. However, that's not uncommon. We would expect to see that in a lot of instances actually where for smaller drainage areas, you'll have a shorter duration governing your peak discharges. They'll give the maximum one. And just to illustrate that, here's some graphics pulled off of StreamStats and their rainfall runoff model in the TR55 method. So 24 hours up top, 6 hours below. And you can see the differences here, 250 versus about 400, so 435, 236. So simply going to a shorter duration, you'll have a flashier but sometimes higher peak. And again, that's going to depend on the drainage area, the actual size itself, but also a ratio of the intensities that are observed between the different durations. And in our study area in particular, they're not as drastic as in some other areas where if you were to go to, for example, the Midwest or the southern states, you might tend to see something where your intensity is much more accentuated or drastic on the shorter durations than it is on the longer, more gradual durations. Alright, so that portion concludes our analysis of differing distributions and durations on the hydrographs. If you want more information on the use and application of restart files, then please check out Appendix B, where it's examined in greater detail associated with the hydraulic variations. But now we're going to shift gears to look at more aggregated data across the whole model. So we'll be looking at different types of graphics and informations now. No more hydrographs for the remainder of this appendix at least. So this graphic here illustrates some of what we already intuitively know. RAS's runtime is directly related to the number of wetted cells, also the max current in any cell and whether multiple iterations are needed. But in general, the sooner that water is applied, the longer that the runs will last. So simulation end times were set based on a fixed duration added to the peak of the storm based on the time of concentration plus a buffer, so we could ensure that the peak was captured. But you can see here that the front-loaded storms are going to result in longer run times than the end-loaded storms, and we see this reflected in the stepped order of Q1 through Q4. We also see a slight increasing trend from MSC1 to MSC6 as we move from more flashy to more gradual. More gradual meaning that more water early on and slightly longer run times. But I think overall it's worth noting that the total spread isn't too significant and that the longest run time is perhaps only 25% longer than the shortest run time. Now this graphic shows the time to peak that was needed or observed in the model at each of the 47 connections based on their drainage area. So this was taken from the flow hydrographs to see where the max flow was applied. And you'll notice that this is for just a single distribution, the nested hyetograph, which has its peak intensity applied at 12 hours. So you might consider the time to peak there just shifting everything by 12 hours. So you'll see that some of the smaller drainage areas that peak will be observed maybe about 45 minutes after the peak intensity is applied, and then spreading across to perhaps around an hour and a half for the larger drainage areas. So it's worth noting that perhaps the increasing trend here is more subtle than one would have thought in terms of the larger the drainage area, the longer the response time, but perhaps not as significant because it's only maybe adding an hour and a half for 85 square miles. And then you can also see the variability there in the smaller drainage basins, and that's going to depend on their individual characteristics such as their orientation, the slopes, the flow paths, and the Manning's end. So this graphic is a box and whisker plot intending to show the relative spread of the influence of curve number variation on peak discharges. And if you recall, we tested 5 different curve numbers, so shown across here, except we're doing it relative to AMC2, so curve number 2 is not shown because that would be relative to itself right at 0%, obviously. So here's our different distributions relative to that. And these plots show a spread of the 5 different distributions that we did. We did the 6-hour and 24-hour for the SES Type 2 and Q1, D1, and then the nested MSC2. And so these are the results of those 5 distributions at the 47 connections, which are represented in these box and whisker plots here. And overall, you can see what a significant effect the antecedent moisture condition assumption has on these loss calculations and the resulting flows. Had we used AMC1 here, shown in blue on each of these, on each of the discharges, we might have expected to see only perhaps a quarter, 25% of what we saw with AMC2. Conversely, had we used AMC3 shown in yellow, we might have expected to see double or even triple the results of what we were seeing. So it's also worth noting that some of these distributions, such as the SES Type 2, are a bit more sensitive and have a broader range or spread to curve number, up to 250% compared to what we're seeing in like NOAA quartile 1, decile 1, for example, is a smaller spread. Similar to the previous slide, this slide shows box and whisker plots to display the effects of depth variation. It also shows a % difference in peak discharges at the same 5 distributions here. So we've got the 6 and 24-hour, the SES Type 2, Q1, D1, and then the MSC4. And for 5 depths, with the median 1.5 being where it would fall on the 0% on the axis here. So And like the previous conclusion, the confidence limit has a significant effect on the results as it directly relates to how much volume is introduced into the model. So the lowest confidence limit of 0.1 could reduce results by 75% to flows resembling only a quarter of the median, whereas the highest of 0.9 could double or nearly triple the flows, is what we saw before. Now the remainder of the presentation here, all the slides are going to be scatter plots that are showing peak discharges from all 47 connections in the model to illustrate the influence of variations by drainage area. This first graphic shows all of the data, and it's meant to be incredibly busy. It shows all of the distribution types and durations. It doesn't show any of the changes in CN or depth though, but the only observation I wanted to make here is that the duration and distribution type you choose has a significant effect on the peak discharges that you will simulate. Now, please keep in mind that it's not an arbitrary assignment to choose a duration or distribution type. Many of those that are modeled here would be inappropriate for this particular basin. However, the purpose of the sensitivity analysis was to assess the relative effects of the various assumptions, whatever those could be. It wasn't to select the most appropriate criteria for this particular study area. So there are distributions and durations shown on this plot that would be totally unreasonable for this study area, such as a NOAA Q4D9. We would never see that in Teller County. Or a 30-minute storm duration for an 85 square mile drainage area would be completely unreasonable. But all the data is shown here simply for illustrative purposes, so you can see between 1,000 CFS all the way up to 35,000 CFS for the larger drainage area based on what you choose. Now this graphic shows the peak flows, those that are the maximum observed of any of the plans simulated by distribution for each drainage area, and also the minimum flows. And again, no surprises here, so most of them here are going to be yellow or gray, where gray is the nested MSC1. This is the one with the steepest intensity, so the least on the curve, on the ramp up and on the tail, and the most on the center of it. And then also with the orange and the yellow being the Q4D9. So again, that's related to the restart file not being used here and the natural watershed storage being consumed by the earlier portion and saving the peak intensity for the very end of the storm after most of that storage has been consumed. Looking at the minimum flows, again, you can see all of them are going to be half-hour durations here, which is an artifact of having small drainage areas, and Q1D1, which is the reverse effect of what's happening up here in terms of you're getting your smallest flows because it's putting the peak intensity on the base or dry terrain and being consumed by that natural storage. And this graphic shows the peak discharges by the drainage area, again, for each of the connections. And you can see this is kind of the bookends of it. You might think of it as each of the quartiles looking at the decile 1, decile 9, and then also how that stacks up relevant to the SES type 2. So these might be the distributions that we think of as a bit more extreme, with in particular Q4D9 and Q1D1, these having the most intense rainfall periods, and D9 comes up on top compared to Q1D1, and again that difference is because of the watershed storage there, but we'd expect these two to be up near the top, and not a huge difference between them in terms of the range actually shown here. And it's interesting to see that they all show up a bit higher than the STS type 2, but in all this isn't too wide of a spread when we compare it to some of the other ones. So looking at this one, similar information, but we've got the nested hyetographs on here and a few of the NOAA quartiles and the SES type 2 as well. So I think what's worth at least noting here is from this portion here at about maybe 17,000 CFS all the way up to about 29,000 CFS. So that's the band that it could vary between based on what nested hyetograph you use, and again the NRCS provides guidance on that, so it's just helpful to know what kind of range they might fall in, and the SES type 2 we see falling in near the bottom of that range, but still within it. The purpose of this graphic was to help compare, just hold the distribution constant. So we're looking at a pretty gradual storm of Q2 D5 across all of the elements, and we're just looking at the impact of duration on the peak discharges. And when we get up to the larger drainage areas, as we might expect, we see the longer durations having the higher discharges. But as we come closer in, we see some overlap, particularly starting here with the 12 and the 24, and then as we go even smaller drainage areas, we see that the 6-hour, the 12-hour, and the 24-hour are all clustered, and even maybe perhaps 3-hour at the very small drainage areas. So again, as your drainage area increases, you're going to have to look at longer duration storms, but as it gets smaller in this region, sometimes you may have instances where your shorter durations, depending on the intensity ratios, could actually give higher peak discharges. This graphic is similar to the one before, holding the duration or the distribution type constant, but just varying the duration, except we're choosing a more drastic storm, the SES type 2, as compared to the gradual one of the Q2 D5. But what you can see here is the spread's just wider and less overlap at the lower drainage areas. This graph highlights the impact of the different depth confidence limits that are used, and it's using the same duration, 6-hour across, and it's looking at the SES versus quartile 1, decile 1, so they're both pretty front-loaded, intense storms. And you can see at the lower confidence limits, they're actually very similar, kind of overlapping between the two, and then there begins to be a little bit of a difference between them as you increase in the depth confidence limit. But not surprisingly, this has a huge impact, anywhere from perhaps 2,500 to 25,000, and it's a very important parameter, and it looks like it's a fairly linear trend as you go across. And as you saw in the graph before that, this graph also shows the same two distributions, STS and Q1D1 for the 6-hour, and now it's looking at the impact of varying the curve numbers between antecedent moisture conditions 1 through 3, and you can see again they're almost identical down near the bottom brackets, but that gap widens as you move further up, and that it's a very significant gap, this one even more than the depth confidence limit, perhaps anywhere from 1,000 to 31,000, and it's also interesting to see how linear these trends are here. This graph shows the impact of the restart files on the peak discharges. So it looks at the SES type 2 here, all the different durations with the restart and without, so whether it had wetted cells or just rain on the dry terrain. And you can see with these brackets here just kind of highlighting the differences between the durations in terms of what degree of impact it had. And again, the larger the drainage area, the greater the relative impact, whereas when we get into some of these smaller ones, they're pretty much posting on top of each other, just because there's really no or very little natural storage in order to consume it. And before we switch slides, take note of the scale here. We're at about 20,000, and we're going to look at the NOAA quartile 2 decile 5 next. So for NOAA quartile 2 decile 5, we see our upper limit here is about 14,000 compared to 20,000. Again, that's just this reflecting this being a more subtle, gradual storm in a way. And you can see it does have a notable impact still with the watershed storage and using a restart file, although less so, again, in the smaller drainage areas. But at the larger ones, we still do see a considerable difference when a restart file is being used. So hopefully this is helpful information to get a sense for the relative change that it could induce by using a restart file. All right, that concludes all of our graphics and looking at the individual data, and now we're going to transition to the last portion of the presentation, looking at summaries from what we've reviewed. This slide summarizes the observations that we've learned about duration. So regarding duration, if the duration increases or gets longer, that effect that it has on the peak discharges actually diminishes as the drainage area decreases, and then sometimes when you get into smaller drainage areas, it can actually flip it to where increasing your duration may actually give you a lower discharge. The nested hyetograph, which is duration agnostic, if you recall, it's incorporating intensities across all the durations, but it's a singular duration across 24 hours. Whereas the SES Type 2 and NOAA distributions are highly influenced by the duration that's selected, and that can be a function of the regional climate and then also the drainage area properties. And one way that you can look to verify that you've selected a reasonable duration is to look for a pronounced peak in your hydrograph and to make sure that it hasn't been muted or missed, to make sure it's sufficiently long. And we'd recommend reviewing historic storms, the actual data themselves, to look at the durations that have occurred as a reference point for selecting a duration. Looking at observations now for distributions, the nested hyetograph by design is supposed to give higher peak discharges pretty much everywhere across the model because it's incorporating the highest intensities. However, even within the distribution that you select, there's a large spread across those different options, so be sure that you're selecting the right one. SES Type 2 and NOAA Quartile 1, Decile 1, they have similar resemblance to each other, and they're going to tend to yield a peak discharge that's maybe on the lower end of the spectrum for nested hyetograph, but still within that. And then obviously the other durations, like the other quartiles and deciles that aren't as drastic, will give lower results. And when a system readily drains, the peak discharges in the floodplain list are going to be driven by those peak intensity more than the total volume or the total depth that's applied. And also this will be drastically affected by natural storage there. Essentially where even if you have a drastic quartile 1, decile 1, or quartile 4, decile 9, the degree in which that there's natural storage there will actually offset the peak discharges still. But overall, the takeaway is that the distribution shape itself is very influential on the results, so you'll want to consult the historic record and any guidance that you have on selection for this, such as the NRCS has spatial delineations, or you can use gridded ratios on depths across different durations. But we would highly recommend that you delineate your model, the basin, by the distribution type when possible, rather than trying to aggregate multiple distributions into a single basin. Looking at the observations pertaining to basin characteristics, the drainage area can increase significantly without significantly increasing the peak timing. But the timing itself can actually vary considerably in smaller basins depending on the basin's characteristics, such as its orientation, the slopes, flow paths, and the Manning's End. And we see that the maximum peak discharges, they may result from differing durations. It's not always going to be the longest, and that's going to depend again on the drainage area and its characteristics that comprise the time of concentration, and then just the degree at which the intensities vary by duration. And some of the distributions are going to be more sensitive to changes in curve number with a broader spread than others. And knowing that the antecedent moisture condition has a tremendous effect on the results, that should be chosen with care and clearly stated. And to conclude our observations, looking at the natural watershed storage, what we learned from that, that mitigating effect that it has can be really significant, and the magnitude is going to vary based on the distribution type and duration that is selected. And that effect is going to become more pronounced with increased drainage area than it would on a smaller basin, and it's going to depend on the basin characteristics itself and where it's located. That can be addressed either partially or fully. You can consume that with restart file or even with pre-processing by actually adjusting the terrain itself. But that decision to evaluate it, whether to leave it in or to consume it, should be based on the terrain. So example, plains with undulating terrain are what's shown here on the right. These are glacial kettles. You wouldn't see that in Colorado, but if you have that, you would leave it in. Whereas if you have steep slopes that should drain and are connected, you would want to address this issue. And in the end, this could be something that you address as part of calibrating your model and making sure to match your observed discharges. So thank you for watching this recording, and if you have any more questions on what we did here in this study, please reach out to the Colorado Water Conservation Board, specifically TWE, and our contact information is here.